Hello, and welcome to the Campus Technology Insider Podcast. I'm Rhea Kelly, Executive Editor for Campus Technology, and your host. A couple weeks ago, Campus Technology held a Distance Learning Summit, a virtual event focused on the most critical considerations for managing higher ed's new normal during the COVID-19 pandemic. In this bonus episode of the podcast, I wanted to share the conversation I had with Dr. Elliot Stern, president of Saddleback College in Southern California, from the summit session titled "What Will the Fall Semester Look Like?", in which Dr. Stern talked candidly about how his institution is making strategic decisions for the fall and what kinds of policies and infrastructure they are putting in place to move forward. He had so many insights and ideas to share, I really think it's worth a listen. One caveat, since this came from a webcast recording, the audio is not the best quality, so apologies in advance, and I hope you find it valuable in spite of that. Incidentally, this session was kind of a follow-up to another interview we did with Dr. Stern for an article back in May called "Why Saddleback College Expects to be 90% Online for Fall." I highly recommend giving that a read as well. You can find it at campustechnology.com. And all of the sessions from the summit are available on demand. Just go to campustechnology.com/summit and register for access. Now, here's my chat with Dr. Stern.
Back in April, Saddleback was among the first institutions to announce that most lecture-based classes would be online in the fall, with the priority for any on-campus courses given to lab, studio, and other hands-on learning. So, Dr. Stern, can you give us an update on how those fall semester plans are playing out or perhaps evolving?
Absolutely. And good morning, Rhea, and good morning to your readers and listeners. Happy to be with you. This is a timely presentation because I think each day and week that goes by, we expect to see greater levels of certainty, and instead we find ourselves in greater uncertainty. But we're in it together, and by sharing ideas, I think it's best for all of us, and all of our institutions will benefit. We were certainly making the call early in terms of our scheduling for fall, but remember that we have several layers of authority over us that still are uncertain in terms of the decision making, particularly given the circumstances we find ourselves in. Our state still has not fully opened colleges and would need to make that call. The county has a say in this, but is unlikely to put a red light in front of us if we did want to go. And I'm part of a district, and the district right now has an emergency proclamation in effect that would have to be lifted or partially lifted for us to bring back students. But if all those things went well and we were able to implement the schedule that we created some months ago, we would be bringing back about 5% of our students, about 100 out of roughly 2,000 sections, where faculty, and it's important to understand this was a faculty-driven process, faculty have determined that the student learning outcomes necessary to complete those courses simply cannot be completed in a virtual environment. So this would be things like labs in the health science field, where there may be external accreditation or program requirements. Some of our professional technical programs, advanced manufacturing, auto tech, have similar certifications. So those classes are still scheduled at this point to be on ground for the lab component. So about 5% of overall sections are technically scheduled as hybrids. Even those, of course, have lecture didactic sections that would be online. So it's really just a piece of 5% that we would bring back. And at this point, I'm uncertain as to whether we would do that today. I think we're going to have to make the call in next week so that everybody has fair notice. And if I had to put money on it right now, I would guess that even if the state, county, and district regulations are lifted, we would probably still delay our first day of bringing students back for those hands-on activities. And what we've done, Rhea, is actually create some redundancy in that scheduling in anticipation of just this sort of scenario. We knew that we probably wouldn't be completing 16 weeks of any hands-on lab. So we scheduled them in such a way that most of them can get by with 8, some of them can get by with 12. So if we had to delay things by 4 weeks or even 8, most courses would go forward without needing to remain in progress at the end of the term.
Mm-hmm. So it sounds like it must be quite a challenge to balance, the need to make plans, but then also keep up with sort of a constantly changing situation where it's impossible to make plans. Does it feel like you're spinning your wheels, or like how do you feel about making plans?
That's a great question, and I appreciate the empathy that's implied within it. This is a very difficult period for myself and all of my colleagues who are in this business of trying to plan while the ground continues to move under us. I do take some solace in knowing, as a person of science, that there is some science under this, and there is some mathematical modeling that we can rely on. And there is data that we can be looking at that gives us some idea of where to go. So we're not really acting. I hope we're not acting by gut hunches. You mentioned that we were the first to create a schedule for fall that announced already that we were going to be mostly online. Well, we weren't soothsayers. We were simply looking at the data and looking at the mathematical modeling, and we're anticipating that we wouldn't be reaching containable levels of disease until summer. And even then, when we released our schedule, people may recall that many of the Asian countries and some European countries that had started to reopen slowly were already starting to see upticks, particularly those that had opened schools. So we kind of knew that either we would be starting late or we would be caught with a second wave sometime in fall, and therefore we wanted to minimize the number of classes that were going. So while there is a lot of uncertainty in this, and it does require some patience with the ability to make planning for those of us who like to be firm in our planning, I think nevertheless it's a good learning opportunity for us to live with a little bit of ambiguity, but at the same time, the importance of critical thinking and relying on data and science, which I wish was happening at all levels of decision making in our society.
Yeah. So with most of your classes remaining online, can you give us some of the details of how that is going to work? Are you doing synchronous online classes, asynchronous? What are they going to look like?
Sure. So we knew that many students were going to have a hard time with an asynchronous distance learning approach. Saddleback was already about 30% online before this happened. We already offered at the time when COVID hit about 50 credentials completely online. So we weren't completely new to this. We were actually a state leader in online. So we definitely had a leg up. But part of that leg up was that we understood that online learning is not for all students. Many students struggle with the lack of immediacy and the lack of connection to a faculty member. So we knew that those students would benefit from some of the national data from synchronous learning online. So we developed a working group. We call it instructional continuity. It's faculty-driven with deans and the vice president of instruction supporting it. And that instructional continuity group came up with a schedule that identified 4 types of classes. And those 4 types of classes are identified according to type on the schedule, so students can choose which of the type they want to fit their style of learning. So I already mentioned the 5% of the classes that are hybrid, that have some hands-on component. The rest, the other 3, are completely online. But within that group of 3, a student could choose a completely synchronous schedule where, for instance, in a 3-unit course, there would be 3 meetings per week of 50 minutes each in a webcast platform such as Zoom, video conference platform such as Zoom, rather, or no sessions synchronously, or somewhere in between, partial synchronous sessions. So that way the student has some options where they can align the online choices according to the learning style. But I really want to praise our district IT and our faculty, because what we were able to do is very quickly and nimbly get those classes labeled as such in the schedule when it was released. So students had those options several months ago.
And for those few on-campus classes, how are you managing things like social distancing requirements and scheduling, for limited numbers of students, I'm assuming, and cleaning and things like that?
Yes, that's the question that most of us spend several hours a day on these days, developing those protocols, developing that planning in the event that we are able to bring some students back. We have several work groups that are involved in this. We have an emergency operating command group and a policy team that's part of it. We have a longer-term planning group that we work with our sister college with on these long-term plans. But I would suggest to your readers and listeners to this webinar the following formula that I sort of keep in my head as a way of thinking about how to deal with social distancing and these issues if you are going to bring students back to your campus. So think of risk as having two aggravating factors, and those would be the proximity between people and ultimately the time that they're going to spend with each other. And then think about the mitigating factors, and the mitigating factors would be PPE, like mandatory face coverings. And of course, for some, it may go beyond that. But then also ventilation, which I think is something, particularly in the last couple of months, we're beginning to appreciate. And in particular, I have to add, many of us have modern educational buildings that do not have functional windows. They're integrated HVAC systems. So the ventilation may not be ideal for the purpose we need. So thinking about how we can recirculate less air and bring in more fresh air to make it more akin, pardon me, to an outside environment. So when you think about that formula and those factors, think about how that's going to affect your planning. So are we going to social distance? Well, of course, proximity is the most important element in the numerator of that formula that I just shared with you from my own ad. And that means social distancing in all classes and sometimes limiting the number of students. So in most of those labs that we're going to bring back, we're probably going to split them in two, and the students will be seen in separate cohorts, separate subsections, if you will, within the same section, much like they're talking about in the K-12 system. In terms of duration, we want to bring students in for as little time as possible just to complete the hands-on activities that they absolutely need and that cannot be virtualized. And then remember the denominators in that fraction, in that formula, if you will, that would be the ventilation component and the PPE. So for us, our district has already mandated face coverings, and face coverings will be mandated on our campus. So those are the most important things, social distancing within the classroom, and we'll do that with signage to remind people. We will do that with red tape on the floor to indicate where people should be and traffic patterns, and of course, outside of the classroom. And here, Rhea, is where I find, to be frank, the most naivete. I think when lay people talk to us about how easy it is to bring students back, they all imagine in their head a classroom where the desks are spread apart and now everything is safe. But that isn't the case at all, because part of where people come in contact with one another is when they come in the classroom, the ingress and egress, or when they come in the building or the hallways of the building. And then we have to think about the places that facilitate congregation on our campus. Do we want congregation? Congregation is not a good idea right now, especially with young people who are not demonstrating full 100% compliance with some of the safety measures that we and government authorities have put in place. So we're thinking about all those things and developing protocols in each of those areas. So even things like bathrooms will have signage to indicate how to wash your hands, that one person should be using the bathroom if it's a small bathroom, a single use at a time, red tape to indicate where people should wait to get into a classroom, much like your grocery store, tapings to indicate where people should stand in line. We've created a schedule where we're informing students that if they do come to campus, they should not arrive more than an hour before their class, so there's not a lot of opportunities to congregate outside of the class. But again, the most important things that I can emphasize would be the need for social distancing within the classroom and mandatory face coverings on our campus. Those are the key elements for us. Everything else is sort of secondary in terms of trying to prevent transmission on campus.
Mm-hmm. In all of this planning, have you come across any sort of unexpected hurdles, that you could share that might be interesting to other institutions?
Sure. I think some of those we're seeing right now. I don't think when we first thought about bringing 5% of our students on campus and creating that schedule, we thought about noncompliance. We just assumed that whatever rules we had in effect would be complied with, and therefore we could kind of design safety into the system. But I think what everybody is starting to realize just from observations around our own community is that compliance is certainly not 100%. And if we don't have a critical mass of compliance, everything we do to create safety is nil. And I think that has to be worked into the equation. If you're designing a system that's going to be 100% safe only if you have 100% compliance, well, that's not realistic on either of those courses. So if you can't do that, one has to ask, are you sure you want to bring those students back? And that's why we've gotten it down to 5%, because to the extent noncompliance is playing a role, we feel that 5% absolutely has to get back to campus because they need it to complete their learning outcomes. And we feel it's easier to control and create compliance for that 5% than it would be if I tried to bring 27,000 students back to my campus at one time. The other things that I don't think I anticipated was the level of fear, not just by students, but by faculty and staff. And I want to be really careful here in acknowledging that fear because I think it's rational, particularly now. I think, there's a lot of debate going on in K-12, and it seems as if out of nowhere that people are starting to ask, well, what about the high-risk teachers? What about teachers who are over 60 or who have immune compromise? I think these are questions that people should have been asking months ago and involving those stakeholders in the decision-making in the participatory governance structures that we all have. But I think the level of fear surprised me a little bit because I thought that people would trust us to make the right decisions, and I have to earn that trust. I have to demonstrate for them and the protocols and having them present at the table, putting aside, many of these things need to be negotiated because they affect working conditions. But even things like bathrooms, things like ventilation, sure, it's the campus responsibility to do those things, but we have to earn the trust of the people we're supporting so that they know that safety is our first and most important goal. And I want to add one more part to that. The other thing I think that we need to share with our employees is that we play a role in the community in providing public health to the community, and particularly to the direct contacts of our employees and students. So for me and Saddleback, it's not really enough to think about keeping our students and employees safe, because if we're allowing disease to spread amongst our students, yes, many of them may be young and may not become critically ill, but they're going to take that disease home to their household contacts. And in reality, what we know for a lot of young people is they're going to spread it beyond the direct contacts in their household. So the last thing that we want to do is be a nidus of infection in our community. So I think that's, if not a surprise, a bit of an awakening. It's part of our evolution in recognizing that one of our priorities is not just to keep our folks safe internally, but to keep the community safe around us and to recognize the role that we play in allowing all that to happen. And then one last fear or one last hurdle or concern that I have and that many have as we go forward is what impact we're having on equity, using our equity lens in making these decisions. We certainly knew that there would be tech gaps, but I think we were surprised at the level of technology gaps when we ran a drive-through so that students could pick up laptops and other devices. We've given out so far over 600 laptops, and we have another round of students that will start in fall, so we'll create another drive-through pickup for them. But the other thing that came up is, of course, lack of Wi-Fi. So we're looking at opportunities to create a Wi-Fi parking lot. Since we're not going to open our Learning Resource Center, we have to account for those needs in students. And then ultimately, we'll be looking at data to identify where we may be actually exacerbating some of the equity gaps on our campus through all online learning or 95% online learning and addressing those in various ways.
Mm-hmm. So going back to, planning for the idea that not all students are going to comply, I think a lot of people are wondering, how do those social distancing rules and policies get enforced on campus? Like, is it up to the individual faculty, or how is your college going to handle it when students are sort of breaking those rules?
That's a great question. And I think, by the way, that's a classic kind of question where many colleges waited until this point to be thinking about that. So a lot of the changes in decision-making that we're reading about, I sense are because colleges are starting to have these discussions and realizing that it's very difficult to make all this stuff work. We, too, are thinking about that as one of the later protocols that we develop, but we are pretty secure that we will have good compliance on campus, but we cannot ask our faculty members to be police officers. So we do have a student code of conduct that does apply to the situation of a student not complying with one of these regulations to social distance or to wear a face covering in class. But we also will have an additional resolution that will give us, through the police force on our campus, the authority to remove people from campus who may not wish to comply with those mandates. And I have to say, I sit in Orange County, and as you may know from the national press, there is a very vocal group of anti-maskers in our county. So we have to be prepared for students who don't just fail to understand the mandate and just need to be reminded of it, but from some potentially who might be politicizing something that is not, in our minds, political in nature. And you have to be ready to walk people out of class if that's the case.
Mm-hmm. What are you planning in terms of testing, contact tracing, things like that?
Also good. I think, we started in the middle, which is what we're doing to make our learning spaces safe. But if we back out from them and take a bigger picture of this, I think we also have to talk about what we're doing on the screening end and then what we're doing on the back end on the tracing end. So let's talk about screening first. You mentioned testing. We're not going to be doing testing. We're not a residential campus. And even if we were a residential campus, I don't think I'd be a big fan of testing. And I'll tell you why. Testing is an indicator of a student or employee status when they take the test. They may take the test on the first day of school and be negative, and then at that point engage in unsafe behavior and become positive, but everyone on campus is given a false sense of reassurance that everyone on campus is tested negatively. So I'm concerned about those kinds of measures that give people a false sense of reassurance, and testing would certainly be at the top of that list. We will, however, engage in screening. So our students will fill out a questionnaire online, and we're developing an online app to make that really easy, and a database that it would feed that we could have access to when they enter a building to check on them, that would indicate that they don't have any symptoms, the usual symptoms that we're looking for COVID-19. We'll also be doing non-contact temperature checks at the major buildings where our classes will be held. So because we're bringing back such a small minority of students, we will never have more than about 150, 200 students total on campus, and no more than about 500 per day. So that amount is just at the edge of our capacity in terms of doing that sort of in-person screening on our campus, which, by the way, I think is another reason to limit the size of students who absolutely positively need to come back to campus so that kind of screening can be done. On the back end, at the tracing end, to the extent that we may have employees who become COVID positive or who've had contact with someone who becomes COVID positive, we have already had a tracking system in place. We have a public health nurse that leads those efforts, and if we need to ramp up as the numbers increase in our community and we bring some students back, we have the capacity to use our own nursing students and our own nursing faculty potentially to help in that effort. But right now, we've been managing it just fine. The levels in our county are such that we do not have adequate tracing for all in our community. So we absolutely have to do it on our campus because we can't assume that the county health department is going to be able to do it.
So what has been the impact on your faculty? I know you mentioned that you had 30% online courses. So obviously some faculty are already accustomed to teaching online, but for the rest, has there been additional training needed?
Oh my goodness, yes. And I have to really praise faculty, but also praise our Faculty Help Center and our distance ed programs, which have been really key in getting that training to faculty, all, I have to add, on a completely voluntary basis. So first, we got a little bit lucky because in the middle of March, when we saw what was going on around us, we were able to develop some quick training to look at the number of faculty that we had who had never taught online and at least get them familiar with the learning management system. So we had some quick workshops through our Faculty Help Center, through our distance ed program, to get faculty trained on at least using the learning management system so that we could actually document that we had real and substantive contact between faculty and students, as is required by accreditation. But beyond that, it was really important to us that our online learning not merely be learning how to use the learning management system, because for the many faculty who had never taught online, it is not enough to simply have the platform and to move your PowerPoints or use whatever modality of teaching you use over to an online environment. That doesn't work very well. So we've since then developed a badge for online learning, and the badge requires 20 hours of participation in workshops and professional development training. And so far, I'm very proud to say that since we created that, we've had over 500 faculty participate in that training. So that means that they're learning the pedagogy, they're learning how to develop a connection, how to establish presence in a classroom, not simply use the learning management system. So a big thank you to my faculty and those who have facilitated that work, because that's been key for us. I hear many stories of students who are coming to us, for instance, because they may not be very happy in the environment they're in at a university, or may not want to pay the university tuition because professors are simply not present in their classes or don't seem to understand how to teach online. And I'm sure we have examples of that we still have to work through. None of us is perfect at this, but I can't emphasize the importance of professional development for faculty, for those of us who've moved online. We no longer have the excuse of saying we're in crisis mode. We have to pivot from crisis mode to figuring out how to get better at this, what we often say is our new reality, our new normal, right? And I think that means getting good at this and helping our faculty get the training they need to get good at it. We're doing this for at least another semester, most likely probably 2, because even if we got a vaccine at the start of the year, we still have to distribute it. So unless someone is thinking that they're going to bring all their students back to classrooms and go back to normal very quickly, we need to think about investing in online learning, and part and parcel of that is hardware and software, but the most important part is professional development for our faculty. And by the way, Ray, I have to add, for our staff and for our administrators too. We all had to learn Zoom, but more importantly, and Teams, the other video network that we use, the other platform that we use, but more importantly, all of our student supports went on. We are completely seamless. Students can get counseling, tutoring, telehealth, telemental health. Everything that we normally developed on ground, we've converted to an online environment, and that all required training. We had staff over spring break going through training to learn how to use those platforms, to try different ones. And at this point, I'm very proud to say, not only is everything online, but we've moved those supports to synchronous platforms, meaning that a student doesn't have to leave a voicemail and wait for it to come back a day or two later, or send an email and wait a day or two later, because none of us enjoy those kinds of support experiences. Instead, we have walk-in service available through almost all the student supports using the waiting room feature of Zoom, for instance, or soft phones. We've used soft phone technology a lot so that employees can forward calls from their office to their laptop with a headset, or to their personal phone or their work phone. And that way, calls can be answered synchronously, and there's human contact. Can't emphasize enough the importance of synchronous contact when we're trying to make students feel welcome and trying to make them feel comfortable in this really scary, anxiogenic environment.
Mm-hmm. I imagine that with all these, using all these new tools, there would also be an increased need for things like IT support. And I'm wondering, have staffers needed to juggle roles? Like, do you need more instructional designers, more IT support?
Yes. We have really robust IT support, both for employees and students. We have students involved in that role as well. But most importantly, we've been very nimble in moving people between support for faculty and support for students as needed, even though those supports are normally provided by 2 different departments on our campus. So really grateful to employees who have been so adaptable and so flexible in going to where they were needed to provide those supports. But I also think what happens in this environment is faculty and other support people who are not IT experts are required by virtue of their contact with students and faculty to help them. When someone has a question, it often goes to the faculty member, even if the question is tech. And the faculty member may refer the student to tech, and we encourage them to do that. But oftentimes it's a quick question, it's something they can help. and allay some of that anxiety that the student is feeling. The other thing that we're looking at for fall is the ability to move some people around who may be in work where there isn't a whole lot to do, or they may not be able to perform their duties from home. And we still have all but about 50 of our employees teleworking at this point. So about 1,350 people are at home and about 50 are on our campus. So how do we move some of those folks around and willingly so that they can help students? So what we're looking at doing is using data analytics to identify those students who are greatest at risk of attrition, and particularly in an online environment. So putting aside normal risk factors, adding to that now someone, for instance, who's never taken an online class before COVID. That would be an additional risk factor. And we started experimenting with this and developed a pilot over summer looking at about 2,000 students who were identified at particularly high risk of attrition in an online environment, and asked counselors to work with them and contact them and to do check-ins. And that's where I want to look at fall, at see where we might move people around to serve as informal success coaches, just to get on the phone with a student and do a check-in and ask how they're doing and make sure that if they have resource needs, they're being referred to the right place. I think that's something, again, as we move from crisis mode into getting better at this, getting better to our new normal, I think we absolutely have to address equity in a big way with those students, not only who lack the technology, but who may not be doing well in distance learning, catch them early and intervene with direct contact.
Do you anticipate, I imagine students are going to need training on even just the basics of using the learning management system. And how are you handling that?
We already, because we were 30% online, we already had a pretty robust tech support program for students, and that will continue and scale up now that all students are online. I think we're over the worst of the hump. The biggest hump would have been when we went online suddenly, and 70% of our students who were previously on ground went online and may not have been great at that. One of the places where we saw it most clearly, and I saw this one in my own personal life, was in our Emeritus Institute program, which is a program for retirees, non-credit classes. And we have about 6,000 folks who engage in those non-credit classes, and the average age is probably somewhere in the 60s or 70s. And we had to shift some tech support to those students in particular to help them get online and figure out how to upload, their works of art, et cetera, to participate in discussion boards. So I think that for me is sort of the canary in the coal mine. I think when we saw those problems, we knew that there were a whole bunch of students out there who needed help. And that's where we shifted some of that tech support towards students as they needed it. And we'll continue to do that going forward as we take in new cohorts of students, of course, for fall and then ultimately for spring. But I think we're over the worst of the hump in terms of students who didn't know how to use the LMS, the learning management system, or who may have struggled with some of the technical difficulties of online learning. For most of our students, where the average age is younger, though, the LMS and most of what they need to do is intuitive, or they figure it out pretty quickly with training videos. Where I think we really should focus in the shift to online learning is meeting needs of the student that are non-technical in nature, the self-discipline required to learn online, the lack of community, the isolation, all the things that go with that. I really think are the unspoken tech issue with online learning that we need to address going forward.
Yeah, that brings me to my next question, was going to be, the sense of community and student engagement with the college is so important, and yet, it's become a lot harder with face-to-face relationships being impossible for the most part. So how do you build that community and engagement?
So I think a lot about that, because I think our faculty and staff already identified as our core value being high touch. We are very proud of the fact that we create a high touch environment for our students, and we kind of have a reputation for that. We take pride in the fact that our students know they are loved and cared for, and that we want them to be successful when they're on our campus. The question becomes, how do you replicate that feeling completely online? And I don't think it's an easy answer. For instance, one of the things we know is that when we work with people, when we communicate with each other in an on-ground environment, face-to-face, there are facial cues and there are body cues. We may lean in. We modulate the tone of our voice. Of course, None of that is present in a non-synchronous environment when you're working on a discussion board or turning in assignments and responding or responding by email. Even in a synchronous environment, even for instance on Zoom or similar video conference platforms, there's something about the screen that's flat. You may see the facial expressions, but it's still hard to convey the emotions. So what we're working on in terms of trying to get better at this is identify those things that we can do that somehow make up for that lack of spontaneous contact and physical signs of love and caring that we can give on our campus. And as examples of that I'm thinking a lot about just in my own relationship with the employees I support is the need to say things in words verbally that we normally may pick up from facial cues and spontaneous exchanges. So to students, I am really glad you were at Saddleback. We are really proud of how hard you're working and how tenacious you've been in getting through this. My goodness, this must be frustrating. To our employees, I understand how hard you are working. I am so grateful for it. I am so glad that you are at Saddleback and that I am your colleague and get to work with you. I think a lot of people struggle with making those sorts of verbal statements, and we really need to get over it because in the absence of spontaneity and physical exchanges, I think we all need that stuff more than ever right now, and we have to find adequate substitutes to express things verbally. In terms of things we're doing to create community and make sure we have the appropriate infrastructure in place to create that sense of community and relationship with our students. We already do a number of updates for students. I've always done a Friday update for campus. I do less frequent updates for students. Some of those we've started to video because I think that's a very attractive medium for many students. With the Friday campus updates, we've done a couple of experiments in the last term before we broke for summer where we did live updates. So I started with an intro, and then we had guests who, for instance, talked about how to arrange your office or working from home. We had our own home design, our interior design department do that. We had our culinary department show how to make bread from scratch at home, particularly in light of the yeast shortage that was going on at the time. We had gardeners talk about creating a home garden to grow some of your own food while you were going to be teleworking. Those sorts of activities kind of bind us together and remind us that we are part of a community. The other thing that I'm looking at fall is more town halls that I've done in the past, and particularly open forums that are very informal and may not even have an address by me, a presentation. It may just be me sitting in a chat room or sitting in a video conference session where it's a designated hour or two where people know they can come talk to me. I think that's really important. I used to do something called Walkabout Wednesdays, where I would walk through campus and talk to employees and talk to students on the quad. And without that, I think there needs to be a substitute. So I need to find a virtual Walkabout Wednesday. Beyond that, what I hope I'm doing and what we're talking a lot about is role modeling that for others. So managers checking in with the people they support, faculty and support staff checking in with students. Whenever we have a student interaction, we ask our staff or faculty to first check in with a student and check on them, see how they're doing. It sounds a little annoying. Maybe it sounds a little woo-woo, depending on your own state of mind. But we think it's really important to do those check-ins to remind students that we care about them, particularly because they can't see it in our face through most of these contacts, and they lack that spontaneity of running into the professor in the hallway or running into me on the quad.
Yeah. So now I think we'll move on to some questions that have come in from the audience. So to start, you had mentioned setting up a Wi-Fi parking lot, and I wonder if you could talk a little bit more about the logistics of that. Is that like going to be just open to anyone? Like how the IT security factor, like how are you handling that?
Of course. So we're already in the process of creating a fully Wi-Fi campus in our external environment. So this is basically an interim step to hasten some of that in one of our parking lots. So we feel confident in the security aspects, just as we do with our external Wi-Fi on campus. As for whether it would be for our community or for students, it would most certainly be just for our students. Again, security issues there, and the students being able to sign on our system, whereas members of the community would not be able to do that. I have to say, the largest of our internet providers in our region, Cox Communications, does put out a Wi-Fi map. So there are other parking lots available, including grocery stores and other areas in our community, where students, but also members of the community, can pull in and stay in their cars and access Wi-Fi. So we're really just talking about being part of that network and making that available just for our students who may have Wi-Fi issues. The other part of that is not just Wi-Fi, but it may be not having a place to study that's quiet. If you have to do a synchronous session, I know I've been on the phone with people who sometimes are struggling with pets and babies and spouses and all sorts of stuff going on in small living spaces. So being able to get in your car and sit in a parking lot and quietly take part in a synchronous session may be really important to succeeding in that class. So I think that's an important thing for us to consider. We have experimented, by the way, and our sister college experimented with hotspots and did not have great success with those. And that's what's brought us to this point where we think we need to at least try a Wi-Fi parking lot in fall. Since we don't yet have the hardware to do that on a permanent basis, it's going to be a couple of years before we do that, we will likely run lines out there. And we will likely provide portable bathrooms to avoid students coming onto campus proper if they're just there to use the Wi-Fi parking lot. And then security, we have a campus police force, and they will enforce security, and we will ask people to stay in their cars. We don't want folks congregating or coming onto the quad or coming onto campus. That just reduces the safety measures for our employees who are on campus or for the few students who are on campus.
Mm-hmm. Okay, next question that came in. If there is a rapid spread of COVID on your campus, will you shut down? What is your sort of contingency plan?
Sure. So we definitely would include the data of what's happening on our campus in our decisions, but we're more likely to be making a soft close or hard close before then based on what would be happening in the community. And that's what happened to us in March, like many campuses. We never had a case of community-acquired infection on our campus, I am very happy to report. But we did have evidence of community-acquired disease that started on March 13th for the first time in our community, and that was the last day that we had in-person class on our campus. We had spring break after that, and then moved to hard close partway through the spring close at the order of our district. So we're looking at community data really carefully, and I would emphasize the importance of looking at this on a daily basis, because when you get infection on your campus, that's sort of a lagging indicator. Really, the signs for that, the risks for that were going up based on what's happening in your community. So I look at the same things that I assume most of your listeners and readers are looking at. I look at positivity rates. Right now in our county, our positivity rate is 14%. We know that positivity rates, initially at least, should be below 5%, then they went up to 8%, and then some people are saying as liberally as 10%. Well, we're at 14%. So right now, we're not going to bring students back to campus. That positivity rate tells us there are too many infections in the community, and those infections, in turn, would lead to infections on our campus. So it's about being proactive and making sure we don't get to the point where we have to make a closure decision based on what's happening and the spread on our campus. To me, that's regrettable when we get to the point where we're actually serving as a nidus of infection on our campus. Other data that I look at, by the way, if people are curious or maybe looking at different data, would be the number of new cases per day, but a moving average over the course of 14 days. I look at hospitalization trends, which is a late indicator, over the course of 30 days. And of course, ICU capacity. We're fortunate, even though we have a very high rate of accelerating disease in Orange County right now, we have a lot of surplus of ICU beds and ventilators, so we're fairly safe rather than running into a crisis situation with ventilator and ICU shortage. But I want to emphasize your decision making should not be waiting for disease on your your campus. Obviously, if we had spread of disease on our campus, we would act accordingly. With a small amount of spread, we would do contact tracing and follow up and try to mitigate it and try to contain it. But with a large spread, we would shut down, of course. But by then, I'm guessing the community data probably told us we should have been making those decisions earlier.
Mm-hmm. So with the impact of the pandemic on the economy, have you been facing budget cuts or, financially, how is this impacting your campus?
Well, like all campuses, we're being negatively impacted in our finances, and there are a number of ways that's happening. Yes, there are budget cuts at the state level. Our student-centered funding formula did not provide a COLA for employees this year, and we are dealing with the ramifications of that across the state. But more importantly, the bigger financial impacts for us fall into two categories. One would be loss of fees, and the other would be increased enrollment. So first, loss of fees. Many of you may not be aware that, when you're not serving students on campus, you cannot legitimize a charge for parking. When your child development center is not open, you can't take in fees. People aren't donating fees to keep our CDC open, our child development center open. We're not renting our facilities the way we normally do. All of those fees for Saddleback amount to $3 to $4 million. That's a good hunk of change that we're going to have to do without this year and figure out where we can make some cuts to get by. That would be bad enough alone if it weren't for the fact that we happen to be facing increased demand. So for us, summer enrollment was up by 17%. At this point, year-over-year comparables for fall are looking up 8%. So we're seeing greater number of students who need our help right now. And those students really fall into one of two groups. One is the recently unemployed student who needs to find remunerative work quickly and is seeking a quick credential. And the other, which is really, I think, the bigger factor for us, are the university students who have elected not to pay $20,000 or $50,000 a year in tuition for distance learning when they can come to us for $46 a unit at a college that's been doing this for quite some time and is working really hard to get even better at it. So I think that demand means we have to find more resources to open up new sections to accommodate wait lists, and that's really hard to do when revenue is actually bottoming out for us. The nature of our business, if you will, is countercyclical. When recessions occur, we get busier, demand goes up, but recessions, unfortunately, usually come with lesser funding. So many of us have faced this unfortunate paradox before of having to do more with less. It was a mantra 10, 12 years ago, and it's going to be our mantra again for the next 2 or 3. Welcome to the new normal.
Yeah. Another question that came up, a good topic, how has accessibility been handled with your move to online learning?
Great question. That we originally did face some hiccups with that. I think that was one of the toughest issues for us, particularly to do virtually. By now, we've been able to accommodate all students requiring accommodations in a virtual environment. And that means, a blind student, a student with a hearing impairment, all of the usual accommodations that we've been able to provide through DSPS on ground, we can now provide to students online. It didn't come easily. We definitely had to work at that, and I think some students struggled as a result, and we're very apologetic about that. We did the best we could in a crisis situation. But again, if there's any group of students that we need to be really careful of to make sure we're not forgetting, it's those students with disabilities who really needed to have those accommodations brought back home quickly. And we did that within a number of days. And for fall, they're all in place already.
All right. Are you planning to measure the success of, those different types of online courses in different formats? Are you planning to get student feedback about their experiences or look at, grades and completions? What do you think about that?
Absolutely. We are a data-informed college, and we are going to be looking at data really carefully. I've already started to engage our institutional research office in looking at some of the data that's already been pulled together from spring. The problem is that spring is really a one-off because we changed our mode of instruction halfway through, and we, like many colleges, also offered full refunds to students even after the term. So this increased the level of attrition artificially, and it's really hard to garner much information from what happened in spring. But we will be looking very carefully at what's happening in summer right now. We're currently about halfway through that term. We'll be disaggregating that data according to the learning mode. We'll be disaggregating it according to student ethnicity, according to first generation, according to low SES, so that we can identify where we're failing. Saddleback is very proud to have minimal or no achievement gap in course success between on-ground and online. That's one of the things that we've worked to do as we went to 30% online. Most colleges, as most of your listeners and readers know, do have gaps between online class success and on-ground success. We did not. But I'm willing to guess that going all online, we've lost that advantage, that we are experiencing gaps. And we already know that for summer, for instance, one of the first bits of data that I can share is that for year over year at this point in the summer, we're seeing attrition levels that are 4% higher than last summer at the same point in the term. So we know that we're not closing that gap yet, and we need to figure out why. And I like the idea of surveying students to measure their experiences, but we're going to look at data really carefully to identify the modes of instruction that are working best. And I think, by the way, just because we offer the modes that fit different learning lifestyles doesn't mean there's going to be a natural and organic way of matching the student to that learning style. We need to help students figure out what's going to work best for them as we go forward. So we're starting to have discussions about how we would do that as well. And lastly, I want to emphasize the importance of data analytics in all of this. Yes, student surveys, but don't forget about the objective data. Don't forget about data that's already there and that you're acquiring that's telling you how your students are doing and where we're not doing a good job.
Yeah, could you maybe elaborate on what are some of those key indicators?
Sure. I mentioned earlier that we started looking at data analytics in spring to identify those students who we thought would be at greatest risk of class attrition, of course attrition. And, you know, every college, whether you use a formal data analytics system or whether you're doing it internally as we do, can find correlates with attrition. So low SES, first-time generation, all those usual correlates with attrition that identify risk in students. But one of the ones that we looked at really carefully in spring were students that were taking a class online for the first time in their education. That we found is a high correlate for attrition. So each college has to identify for itself what those correlates are, and then either through a formal data analytics system or through your own internal systems, filter for those students, identify them, and then figure a way to reach out to them as we did in summer with counselors, but we're probably going to have to find other ways of doing that because our counselors are overwhelmed at this point. So we may need to just move other employees around to call people who we think would be at risk and to keep a close eye on them. And I think this is a learning of the COVID crisis. I think we in higher education tend to throw a lot of resources out there, and we aim those resources at all of our students equally. And increasingly, because of scarce allocations and more sophisticated analytic potential, we realize that it's probably smarter to identify those students who are at greatest risk and aim your resources, whether that's a success coach, whether that's somebody doing a check-in or doing a mid-semester report, aim the resources of the students who are found to be greatest at risk. That's going to be really important for us in fall and moving forward.
Okay, one last question here. Do you have staff or faculty who don't want to come back to campus, and do they have the option, or are there people who need to be on campus and how but might not be feeling good about it?
I'm sure there are, and one of the things that drove our initial schedule was having faculty at the table and helping us make the decisions about which class sections would come back. So to the extent that sections ended up on the list of classes that are coming back, it's because faculty themselves felt that the student learning outcomes couldn't be achieved virtually. In some of those cases where faculty are now not comfortable coming back, they're taking another look at how virtualized software and other modalities may allow them to do what they want to do online. So we've been able to shrink that class even more. An example of that is in the sciences, where we've had great success with Labster and other virtualized labs, and now we've installed video streaming software and hardware in our classrooms where we can do lab demonstrations for students online. And only, I think, one small area of chemistry and organic chemistry requires on-ground. So because faculty have been in charge of the decision-making about what's coming back, faculty know that they have the power to pull those classes off the list if there's a way to achieve those outcomes elsewhere. In some areas, we just have no choice. Like nursing, we have to achieve our clinical outcomes in order to be certified for our nurses and to keep our program going. In those areas, our faculty understand the importance of what they do. And like all of us, we might feel more comfortable teleworking, but we also all have jobs to do, and they've been more than willing to do it when students are concerned.
Mm-hmm. Do you have any final advice for institutions who are still struggling with this decision for fall?
I think it's time to make the call, folks. I think if the schedule isn't in place right now, you're a bit late to the party. But I think for all of us, I would say this as a final thought. We are representatives and role models for our community. Sometimes we're the largest employer in our community. We have a job to do in promoting public welfare and good, and that means in promoting things like face coverings and social distancing, but also not making decisions that puts the public health at risk. I think that's really important for us to keep in mind. We support the local economies, but our top value has always been to protect the health of our students and employees and the health of their families and our community. And I would urge everyone to keep that top of mind. There are lots of ways to achieve learning continuity, and I would rather invest in new technology for online learning than in a bunch of plexiglass boards to divide up classrooms when that's not really a substitute for good learning anyway.
Thank you for joining us. I'm Rhea Kelly, and this was the Campus Technology Insider Podcast. You can find us on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify, and Stitcher, or visit us online at campustechnology.com/podcast. Let us know what you think of the podcast or what you'd like to hear on future episodes. Until next time.